Welcome to the Orthocast. Today we have Drew here today, and he was actually raised Mormon and eventually found the Orthodox Church. And, me growing up, I wasn't raised with any religion, but there was a lot of Mormons in my area. And I would say the things I like about them is, they're generally like really nice people. But the more you look into Mormonism, there's some very interesting and weird practices, especially a lot of things that are tied into like Freemasonry. So thanks for coming on, Drew. How was it being raised Mormon?
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Kyle. Actually, I was raised in the Los Angeles area. I was in my friend group, I was the only Mormon in the group. But overall, I had like a really happy, well-adjusted childhood. Nothing really weird at all that happened. And I just considered myself like another, version of Christian. And that's usually how I would frame my belief system to my friends who were usually completely like a-religious. That was like my upbringing was really nice because the nice thing about the Mormon community is they have a lot of activities for kids, like good friend group. And it was just really family friendly atmosphere. Like I come from a family of 6 kids. So, I have a lot of siblings and we're all really close. I did a lot of cool extracurricular stuff like the Boy Scouts program, which probably kept me like doing things constructive, on the weekends. I'd say overall it was really good. I'd say like up until high school, they have you do seminary. So before you go to school, I actually had to wake up at like 6 a.m. And do like what we call scripture study, where you're studying either like the New Testament, Old Testament, or some of the other Mormon books in the canon. And even during that time, like going through the seminary classes, I never really thought something was amiss when it came to Mormonism. Like I never heard any kind of talking points against Mormonism from any of my friends. And that was like kind of pre-internet. So I wasn't ever exposed to any kind of like counter-apologetics to Mormonism. It wasn't until I went on a Mormon mission. I actually did my mission out in Ohio, which if you know anything about Mormon history, there's a lot of Mormon history in Ohio, and it's not all good history. So it wasn't until I got out there that I, for the first time in my life, encountered like real arguments against Mormonism, people claiming that it had more sordid history than, I was raised to believe. That was kind of, I would say, when I started to really question just in small ways, like, okay, this isn't as straightforward as we're the restored Church of Jesus Christ.
Yeah. And Mormons, when you like graduate high school, don't you go on like a missionary trip? So your missionary trip was to Ohio, but people will go like all over the world, which is, I think is actually kind of good, like to get some commitment because it gets people to like stay in it. And you were talking about like, in school, like you would do the seminary before, like make sure that you actually like know what you're talking about, which is interesting because I was actually like walking around in my neighborhood and there was the Mormon kids on the bike and they were really friendly and nice and they gave me a Book of Mormon. I tried to, talk to them a little bit. So it was when you went to Ohio and you start hearing like counter arguments, was it like, did that lead you to like atheism? Did it lead you to like maybe, to study Christianity more or? Yeah, what happened?
Yeah, so I would say the good thing about doing like the seminary program is I actually really did learn to love the Bible. In fact, pretty early on, I actually preferred reading the Bible to the Book of Mormon. And when I would teach people on my mission, my approach was always like, hey, I'm going to try to argue for my worldview out of the Bible. I'm going to try to show them that there was an actual ecclesiology in the New Testament times. We'd say prophets and apostles, but I'd use scriptures like in Ephesians to talk about how, the church was built on the foundation of prophets and apostles. And, he called teachers and prophets and apostles in Ephesians 4. So I would use like a lot of Bible scriptures because honestly, like I just felt like it was a better way to go. But there were like random times where someone would just point out something extremely obvious to me. Like I'll never forget this one kid. He was like, well, how come you guys believe like you have to be married to make it to heaven, or at least the highest level of heaven? But here Paul says it's better not to marry. Like obviously Paul is speaking like very highly of the ascetic life. And like for the first time, I was just like completely stumped, and I had no idea like how to make sense of that. So I would say, to answer your question, like I didn't ever go into atheism, but it definitely like made me a little more nihilistic, I would say, in like post mission life. Like I went to college in San Diego. I was pretty worldly. Like I would go to church every Sunday, but I didn't go to the temple, you know, as often as you were supposed to. I thought it was weird in the temple. So I guess I just became a little more like disenchanted with like religion in general, but I was never like a cringe, you know, fedora tipping atheist.
Yeah.
I actually started reading apologetics against atheism. I started reading, you know, people like Edward Fazer. You might have heard of him. He's like a Catholic apologist against atheism.
Yeah.
So yeah, I actually started getting into Christian apologetics because Mormonism doesn't really have an answer to atheism at like an academic, you know, level. So yeah, I was never an atheist, but again, like I became less interested in Mormonism over time, and I became more interested in like Christian apologetics. I was really into like libertarian politics. That was also becoming like my new religion in a way.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I'm sure you've had people, you know, on the channel who've had that same phase of like you go into like the libertarian scene and then you go into like the Orthodox way because you realize politics is just kind of like, again, it's nihilism, it's a waste of time, and it's not going to change anything.
Yeah. Yeah, you just covered a lot of good points. Yeah, when I actually talked with the Mormon who came in my neighborhood, I was telling them about like in the early church, I was talking about like asceticism and monastic life and like monasteries. And he's like, "Oh, I've never heard about a monastery." And I'm like, "Oh, you should like look it up and like look into it. Like this is the historic church." And I'm like, "Why should you trust the Book of Mormon versus, you know?" But he said it had continuity and
we can actually get into that because one of I think the most common misconceptions is that people think that a lot of weird doctrines come from the Book of Mormon. They actually don't. If you read the Book of Mormon, it's actually pretty tame as far as what it contains, and it's pretty much just like 19th century Protestant low church Christianity, revival Christianity is a lot of what you'll find when you read the Book of Mormon. In fact, the God that you read about in the Book of Mormon, it's actually modalism in the Book of Mormon, where Jesus himself is saying, "I am the Father and the Son." And it even said that Mary bore the Father of all mankind. Like, it uses a lot of language that's actually modalism. And it's all about just faith, repentance, baptism, receiving the gift of the Holy Ghost. It doesn't mention any temple ordinances. It does. In fact, it's actually anti-Masonic because at that time when Joseph Smith wrote the Book of Mormon, there was a lot of newspaper articles regarding William Morgan who exposed the Masonic rites. And so Masons were seen as kind of like the bad guys at that time. Andrew Jackson was running for president. He was a Freemason. So Joseph Smith also wrote a lot of anti-Masonry talking points into the Book of Mormon. He called them secret combinations and how they would overthrow all the governments of the world. But again, this is early Mormonism we're talking about, where it was, again, just meant to be like a more simplistic version of Christianity. It was meant to be anti-Masonic. It was meant to be, hey, you believe on the Lord, you'll be saved. Water baptism is in there as well. But again, it doesn't have all the weird things you often associate with Mormonism being a heretical belief system. That stuff came later in Joseph Smith's life. It came about a decade later when he was in the Nauvoo area. He started practicing polygamy. He became a Freemason. So that's where you actually get different flavors of Mormonism depending on which period of time we're talking about and which book we're talking about.
Yeah. And Joseph Smith, he was from New York, but I know a lot of Mormonism is focused in like Utah, Idaho area. So
correct.
Like is that where he was like revealed the golden tablets and everything, and that's where it kind of got weird, like later in his life?
Yeah, and so this is where we get into like things that start to make Mormonism not such a straightforward story of him being called as a prophet, because when he was living in the Palmyra, New York area, he was well known as a glass looker. So he would actually look into a rock and he would tell people where treasure was buried. I mean, this is a matter of history that the Mormon Church now, you know, accepts and is like willing to come forward with. So he was all into really digging for treasure, going on these treasure digs. They had a lot of interesting like metaphysical beliefs regarding the treasure, that there were like guardians, guarding the treasure, and that you had to do a certain spell in order to like let the guardian, or the guardian would then let you through if you said like certain keywords. So yeah, he was doing weird things. He was actually taken to court over it because he told someone he could look into, a seer stone and tell them where treasure is buried. And he was actually he was originally charged with disturbing the peace, but they let him off because he was pretty young. I think he was like 18 at the time. So this is actually one of the first things that was written about by Michael D. Quinn. He was a former Mormon historian, and he was actually excommunicated from the Mormon Church for pointing out the occult and the magic that played a role in Joseph Smith's early life and development. And so this is where we get into things that the Mormon Church used to say, oh, well, that's anti-Mormonism, don't believe it. But now they say, okay, yeah, he did, use magic and occult practices. And it's very similar to what he used to find the Book of Mormon. In fact, he used that same seer stone to translate the Book of Mormon. So once you start getting into that, and I've even heard a Mormon apologist say, you know what, I think it's really cool that he used things that, John Dee used, because John Dee was a famous glass looker from the British Empire, and he would write in the Enochian language as he was seeing things on a seer stone. Yeah, there's people who even say, I think it's awesome that he did that. I mean, they're usually just kind of gaslighting you at that point.
Yeah.
But yeah, so you could make connections to him being visited by an angel. At one point he said it was Moroni. At another point he said it was Nephi. But this angel almost stands as like that guardian of the treasure, and the treasure is the golden plate. So you see a lot of those patterns play out. He has to visit it like 3 times, and then finally the angel lets him take the plate. But to kind of end my point here, the weirdest thing about all of this, all that time that he was being prepared by the Lord to receive the plates and to translate them into English, when he goes to translate the plates the first time, you might have seen the South Park episode about this. He actually gives them to his associate, Martin Harris, who's helping him with the translation process, because Martin Harris is giving all of his money to publishing this sacred book. So his wife is very skeptical, and she's like, I want to see these manuscripts. And this is where we get the lost 116 pages that South Park actually featured in their episode, because she kind of knew it was a hoax, and she kind of knew that her husband was naive. And so she didn't want him being taken to the cleaners over this, fake book. So she ended up destroying, we're pretty sure she threw the manuscript in the fire, all 116 pages that Joseph Smith had translated up to that point. And so you think Joseph Smith would just retranslate it, but he doesn't. He actually starts at a different part in the Book of Mormon because he said the Lord told him to, and that people would use that to, I don't know, catch him or something in a lie. But the weird thing is, at that point, he's now beginning the translation process of the Book of Mormon we have today, and he doesn't once use the gold plates. He never uses them to translate. He looks into a hat with a seer stone in it, and that's how we get the Book of Mormon. So never were the gold plates used, which is so weird because they were preserved for centuries, and wars were fought over them in the Book of Mormon, and he had to run with them. By the way, they weigh about 100 pounds. So he had to run with them while mobs were trying to get him, because these were his old gold digging associates who were trying to attack him because he was up to something that they were involved in. So it's just weird that he went through all this trouble, but yet the Book of Mormon we have today was never translated by him looking at the gold plates and being able to be told by the Lord what the English was. But if you look at Mormon art, a lot of it does show him studying the gold plates. So again, this is another lie. It's just dishonest for the Mormon Church to publish these pictures of him looking at the gold plate and reading out in English what they say. That never happened. It was him looking at a seer stone.
Wow. That's really interesting. Do they still have the gold plates, or do they like lose them?
So that's like where we don't know at all if he ever had them in the first place, because he said they were taken up to heaven by the angel as soon as he was done with the translation process. There were times when he translated and they were still on the ground. I mean, so they just had nothing to do with the translation process. There are people who claimed they saw them. You have like the 11 witnesses who claim to see the golden plates. The problem there is if you actually look at their account, they say they saw them with their spiritual eyes. So one of the things about 19th century Christianity is a lot of people were having visions, a lot of people were engaged in prelest, and a lot of people would just claim they saw things. Like there's another story at the same time that Joseph Smith was around where people said they saw an angel on top of a roof, and there was like 20 witnesses to it, and they all signed a legal affidavit that they saw it. So a lot of people were seeing a lot of things in those days, and they were willing to even like put their reputation and name on the line. And a lot of the witnesses to the Book of Mormon ended up joining other cults right after Joseph Smith was killed. They actually ended up joining up with a man named James Strang, who claimed he was the predecessor to Joseph Smith, and he also translated some records, and they all joined him, and they all witnessed his miracle too. So it's just like these people were definitely, I don't want to say they were like super gullible, but they were, if you're looking for signs and you're looking for miracles, like you will be deceived either by yourself or by supernatural forces that aren't of God, quite frankly.
Yeah. No, that's so important that we're not seeking like signs and wonders, because that's how the devil is going to trick you. And why in Christian history with Revelation, it should always have like continuity with the prior revelation. But I wanted to cover about, so it sounds like, you went to college, you kind of like weren't taking Mormonism that seriously, but you want to defend against atheism, so you're looking into like apologetics, which is like when I was an atheist looking into Christianity, naturally I found a lot of apologetics videos just because like I had a question, and so it's like you get into apologetics because you have those questions yourself. So did that lead you to like just becoming like a generic Protestant, or like what was your route from that point in college to Orthodoxy?
Yeah, I would say, so just to kind of give like some background, I didn't find Orthodoxy until about a few years ago, and I'm in my mid-30s now. So it was actually well after college. So I would say I was just really into trying to find like the true version of Christianity in history. But the thing is here's the thing about like anti-atheist apologetics. Like if you're watching like someone like William Lane Craig, he's obviously the most famous person arguing with atheists. It's good to know those talking points, but it can serve as a distraction, because what William Lane Craig is describing is natural theology. And as we all know, it's not really narrowing it down to who we're worshiping and how we're worshiping. It's just narrowing it down to this God that the Muslims and the Jews can also claim, the Abrahamic God, if you will. So I guess like I was more just like distracted by things that weren't really narrowing it down for me. And it wasn't until I discovered Jay Dyer a few years ago. Big shocker there. It wasn't until I discovered him that I actually found someone who was really narrowing it down as far as like connecting those apologetic talking points to actual history of Christianity, like marrying the two together. That was the first time I had ever heard of that. Even like Catholic apologists rarely were making arguments from like the church fathers. I usually heard them quoting Aristotle, which is just quite weird, because I get it. Like Aristotle and the first cause arguments work when you're talking to an atheist, but they don't narrow it down for you to actually find, where the church is and where can we see it in history.
Yeah. No, that's such an important point, is like generic apologetics can only go so far. And a lot of these like top Christian, debaters, they're not like, my version of Christianity is correct. They're not even proving Christianity. They kind of like focusing on proving like a generic theism, versus like Jay Dyer is very like specialized. He's like, no, it is the Orthodox worldview and everything else is false. And that's why I try and do in my channel too, is like I want to lead people. It's like, yes, we need to like come to the fullness of the truth, not like a generic theism, not other Christianities, but like, real Orthodox Christianity.
Yeah, exactly. I would say it was the first time I was ever challenged in my specific worldview, because if you listen to like someone like William Lane Craig, like he will mention here and there, like, yeah, Mormons aren't real Christians, but that's not really like what he's arguing for, is a specific type of Christianity that excludes other, heretical or schismatic groups. So when Jay Dyer would argue for the Orthodox worldview, using things like the transcendental argument for God and this whole idea of coherentism, actually making sense of the world through a specific worldview.
Yeah.
I mean, I never had seen apologetics done that way, and obviously he pulls in like Greg Bonson, clips to kind of show how presuppositional apologetics works. So, and then also just hearing J. Dyer say that Mormonism is a cult, people think like, oh, that's really mean, that's not charitable. Well, it was the first time that someone just straight up said it, but then could back it up with actual historical arguments. Like, here's why it's a cult. And so I think like it's one thing to say, yeah, Mormonism is a cult. It's another thing to be able to show historical continuity of your worldview and show the discontinuity of the Mormon worldview. I think that's seriously what like won me over is like, okay, like Father Josiah Trenham says, if you can't find your worldview before the year 1500, what are you doing? How do you consider yourself a Christian?
Yeah, exactly. So how long did it take to like you're watching these videos, you're like, oh, this guy's making a lot of sense. How long did it take you to say, you know what, I'm gonna like go into an Orthodox church? Especially the Divine Liturgy is like a lot different than the Temple or what you were before.
Yeah. So it took me, I'd say, a couple of years. And the reason is because I'm married, I have little ones, and it's just like a big move because my entire family's like very Mormon. They're very active in the church. And so honestly, it was just like fear of the social repercussions of coming out and saying like Mormonism isn't true. But I did tell my wife probably like a year and a half in, hey, I just don't think Mormonism is true. I've been like studying a lot of the history of Christianity and theology, and I just don't find it a compelling worldview. And there's a lot of problems with it too.
Yeah.
And so I didn't like, come out swinging. I wasn't trying to be like, bashing it because I know it's like still something that was really important to her at the time. Mm-hmm. But it honestly, like it broke her heart, and it was just kind of like a bit of a struggle between us as far as like me telling her, like, because she had asked me at that time, like, what do you think is true? Like, are you an atheist now? Like, she was just a little worried about the, instability that I might have been bringing to the marriage. Yeah. But at that time, I did say, you know what? I think it's the Orthodox Church. Like, it seems to have like the best justification for its system of worship and belief and theology as far as like having continuity with the church of the first 1,000 years. So I was able to tell her that, but again, in her mind, she wasn't very familiar with Orthodoxy. She just thought of Orthodoxy as just a bunch of weird monks at a monastery, and she thought I was going to become a monk and leave her, and like, go live the ascetic life without her. So yeah, it was a struggle, but I will say there was a lot of things happening in the LDS church at this time because we had COVID happen.
Oh.
And and so like the Mormon church shut down, no questions asked, all globally. Like every temple, every church was closed for 9 months. No one was allowed to set foot on any property for 9 months. And so this also happened around that time. And so this definitely got my wife thinking like, I mean, it got it got a lot of Mormons thinking like, wow, this is really weird that we're just like, bending the knee. We're just like giving up everything that's most precious to us so that, we can take part in the psyop. So like that, I think that's like, honestly, was kind of what won my wife over, because as we started watching like, Jay Dyer and also Father Josiah Trenham, she really like related with him because he's a father, he has a lot of kids, and she just saw him as a little bit more relatable.
Yeah.
I think just like hearing from him and hearing like how he speaks out against, certain cultural agendas with boldness, but also with love. Just showing her things on YouTube like, hey, these people are actually serious about their faith, unlike what we're seeing in our camp currently.
Yeah.
I really think that was like God's way of showing her like the clear contrast between like, and I even texted my family about it during, the unfortunate incident, of 2020. Mm-hmm. I even texted my family and was like, hey, this doesn't make sense. The Christians of early Christianity would have never like bent the knee in this way. They were all martyred for their beliefs. And so I was like making those connections even to my family and to my wife. And yeah, I think over time she was able to see like, okay, I think we should take a second look at this. And obviously I told her all the things wrong with Mormonism, and over time that also like started to click. Like, Joseph Smith took people's lives, for instance. Like, do you feel okay about that? And at first she was like, yeah, I don't think it's a big deal. And then over time she's like, you know what, I think it is kind of a big deal as I, again, compare it to real Christians living out their beliefs.
Yeah. Wow, that's amazing. So, did you guys go to an Orthodox church as a family, like for the first
Mm-hmm.
time, and like convert together as like your entire family?
Yeah, so I told her, when she was a little bit iffy about it, I told her, like, well, I'll still go to the Mormon church, but I am joining. Like, I just told her that. I am
Yeah.
joining, but I'll respect her belief. And honestly, it was kind of like, bleak thinking about us being like an
Yeah.
interfaith marriage, whatever they call it.
Hmm.
Yeah, it was just very bleak, but I kind of just never really felt too, like, down about it for some reason. I always just kind of had hope, like, that truth would win out. And my wife, to her credit, she's super open-minded. Like, at no point did she ever, like, get angry or belligerent with me or defensive. Like, she just knew that I was trying to be closer to Christ at the end of the day. Like, I think she could see that in how I was talking about these things with, trying to have charity, but also trying to speak truth and boldness. So yeah, I would say what really, like, it's actually funny. The story is, like, we were watching the general conference. It's like a worldwide conference where the Mormon prophets and apostles come and speak to the world, but mainly just Mormons. And they watch it on their TV, and it's filmed out of Salt Lake. Well, at that time, they supported a really controversial bill here in Arizona where we live. I won't go into the details of it, but it was basically just a super pro-Skittles bill.
Oh yeah.
And the LDS Church actually, like, came in full support of it. And at that general conference, they basically told all of us, like, you need to be okay with us,
Wow.
supporting things like this. Like, this is the march. Progress marches on, right?
Yeah.
And at that point, she watched that, and she was like, all right, let's go check out the Orthodox Church. So I was like, all right, all right.
That's
So that was,
amazing.
like, what
Yeah.
really kind of pushed her out the door because, again, she's very traditional
Yeah.
minded, and so am I. And so they're kind of going that way as a church. Like, I guarantee you in the next 20 years, we'll see them, embracing all the things that Protestant churches are
Yeah.
embracing. So yeah, we went to an Antiochian church in the area. We went to a Vesper service because I heard that was, like, the best thing to kind of dip
Hmm.
your toe in the water with. And I emailed the priest. He was super friendly, tons of converts, tons of families at this parish. It's an amazing parish. The priest and my wife just get along so well. He's, like, so perfect for her as far as, like, his personality versus her personality. Like, I was worried there would be, like, this super, like, stoic, like, stone-faced priest who would just tell her to repent. But
Yeah.
he's like the opposite of that, where he's just like, hey, I get it. This is new for you. Like, let's help you kind of learn this slowly at your own pace. So yeah, very good at catechizing us. And yeah, we went through catechesis together for about a year, and then we were received right before Pascha of this year
Wow.
with our three children. With our three children, by the way. So yeah,
Yeah.
family of five, all baptized and chrismated, and yeah, loving our parish, loving the parish life, tons of great friends. So it's really been a joy and a blessing to have a parish like this so close to us.
Yeah. Glory to God. That's amazing. So how about your parents? How did in your other Mormon friends, how did they react? Like, were they okay with it? Because I know some families will, like, shun you, or like how has that been?
Yeah, so it's been pretty rough with my parents, and I think this
Yeah.
is more of, like, a generational thing because my siblings took it a lot better. Um, like, my parents just, like, were heartbroken. In their mind, I'm now an apostate is the word they would use, like,
Oh.
someone who's left the true faith, someone who's given up all the blessings of the temple for me and my family. So yeah, understandably, they were, like, devastated. And I think there just really hasn't been a conversation with a lot of my family because I think they really are hesitant to even go there with me. Like,
Hmm.
I did write them all an email kind of detailing generally why I was leaving. I talked about how I just felt like I have found the true church. I have found the church established by the apostles and
Hmm.
preserved, through history to this very day, and that we have bishops who can trace their authority back to the
Yeah.
apostles. Um, and so I did detail just the basics of why I feel like this is just far more compelling than, what I had before. I did have one of my siblings talk to me a little bit about it and kind of see why. But again, the conversation is really hard to have because, and you'll find this when you talk to Mormons, there's a lot of word concept fallacies when you're dialoguing with Mormons. Like I described like the Trinity and how I always saw that as I was reading the Bible. I always saw that God was tripersonal, but there was always one God. And that always made me uncomfortable as a Mormon when Jesus said like the Father is in me and I am in him, like, you know, the indwelling. I never could make sense of that from a Mormon worldview, and it almost made me uncomfortable reading those scriptures because I was always like, something's happening here, or there's something here that's not as simple as just polytheism, obviously. So I tried to explain that to, you know, one of my siblings, and they were like, yeah, that's what we believe. And I was like, no, not really, like at all. So I think like it's always good, and you know, I've learned this as I've been dialoguing with, you know, Mormons online, and maybe people listening have experiences as well. It's always good to unpack terms. It's always good to like explain like, no, actually we believe God is uncreated. He's always been God. We believe the Godhead is eternal. They've always been the Godhead. We believe they have one will. So you have to explain these things because people will be like, oh yeah, we believe something similar to the Trinity or, you know, the triune God, but they don't. And so, yeah, this is where we can kind of get into, you know, the differences in theology. But to answer your question, yeah, it's been pretty rough, but I think like I still try to maintain a relationship with my family because I don't want to have any kind of like, you know, that stress hanging over my head or the head of my family.
Yeah.
But it's definitely different. You know, there's definitely like a little bit of awkwardness there for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think it's important to maintain a good relationship, you know, with your family, no matter what. And sometimes, you know, you just have to be really patient and, you know, pray. And it's like, you don't, you know, it's not worth it to get into like arguments, but if you can like have a good relationship and maybe they'll just start getting interested and they see that this has been a positive effect on you and they may be curious in the future. But the next thing I wanted to talk about.
Yeah, I truly, one thing I'll just throw in there. I truly believe they will like be more interested in Orthodoxy as time goes on. Given what's happening in our society and the other church going along with those things that are happening in society. So it's something that I welcome and I look forward to because I know it's only a matter of time.
Yeah, I'm sure you're going to be completely right about like the path that the Mormon Church is going, and then maybe that will be the wake up call. Maybe in, you know, a few years, you know, 10 years, they'll like wake up and see something is seriously wrong with the Mormon Church. But yeah, so the next thing I wanted to talk about was the temple worship, because the Mormons are very secretive about their temples. Like normally they don't allow video, they don't allow non-Mormons, I believe. So what is it like it in there? And like, yeah, what would you say about the temple?
Yeah, I would say you don't go until you're 18, because so my entire life I never went to the temple until I was 18. So that in itself kind of gives you like the idea of how you really need to be well entrenched in Mormonism before you ever see the inside of a temple. And if you're a convert to Mormonism, they don't let you go in until you're a year in. So again, you can kind of see a pattern here of like not exposing people to it too soon.
Yeah.
But I grew up, you know, my parents would go on the weekends and I never knew anything about it. They would go to the temple, they'd come home, never speak of it. And so I went for the first time when I was 18 before I left for my mission. And, I guess I would have been right about 19. And yeah, the first time you go and most people you talk to who are being honest, they're like just weirded out by it. Because there's just a lot of weird things. And you see, but the thing is you're going with all your family and friends and they're there to support you. And so you're doing a lot of weird things and you're putting on weird clothes, but you're with all your Mormon family and friends and they're all doing it too. So it would be weird. It would take a special kind of person in that situation to be like, oh no, this is horrible. I reject all of this. Most people are going to be like, well, this is weird, but I guess I'm the one who has the problem because I just don't get it yet, but maybe I'll understand it more and more as I go to the temple more and more. So yeah, I think like the best way to describe the temple in a nutshell is the main thing you go and do is watch a video where it goes through like what happened with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And this is where we kind of get into like Gnostic takes on the scriptures, because this is one thing that always bothered me ever since I went to the temple is in the video, Adam and Eve are tempted by Satan, and these are like actors playing Adam and Eve and Satan. Back in the day, it was really cheesy, like acting. Like it was really hard, like not to laugh or really hard to take it seriously. And by the way, you're in a dark room and you're watching a movie. That in itself is just kind of, rubs you the wrong way.
Yeah.
Like, normal churches don't do that. So I would always watch it, and Satan would tempt Eve. But like over time, they actually changed the video to make it so that Eve was kind of like doing the right thing by following Satan. And this is where we get into like weird, like Gnostic belief, where they believe like Lucifer is the light bringer. Gnostics believe this, and they believe like he is like against the evil god, a Yahweh. This is what Gnostics believe traditionally. And so it has some of those elements to it because Mormons believe that the fall was a good thing and that it was actually a good thing for Adam and Eve to listen to Lucifer. And I always noticed that in the movie, and it always like rubbed me the wrong way because I'm like, wait, we're being told to follow the example of Adam and Eve who disobeyed God and obeyed Lucifer. There's something wrong here. And so, again, it's just like one of those things where it's not until you study, like, again, Gnosticism, that you can make sense of why they would have that in the video. But again, over time, like they also just had more like a feminist angle to it, where Eve was the smart one because she followed Lucifer first, and she listened to her womanly intuition. She listened to her womanly intuition and like partook of the fruit. But then it's funny because in the video they quote scripture where she says, "The serpent beguiled me, and I did eat." So she's super smart and super savvy and knows exactly what she's doing, but then she was beguiled according to the scriptures. So it's a very awkward like theology that they have around the fall because they call it a fall forward. Like they believe Adam and Eve needed to have children and they couldn't have children unless they fell. So they kind of make it so that their God in their movie, he gives them conflicting commandments. Hey, I want you to multiply and replenish the earth, but I also want you to stay away from the fruit. And so they believe Eve was wise to go with the first commandment so that they could fulfill the second. Or sorry, they believe Eve was wise to disobey when it comes to the fruit so that she could fulfill that commandment of multiplying and replenishing the earth, which is also why, Mormons are really big on having kids.
Yeah. Because
that's exactly what Adam and Eve was motivating them to, disobey God. They needed to have kids so we could all come here and receive our bodies, come from the spirit world and receive our bodies here on earth.
Wow. That's
so
crazy.
There's a lot more we could go into, but that in itself, rubbed me the wrong way. And I'll just say one other story that started to, we have a phrase in Mormonism called breaking your shelf. You start putting things on the shelf and eventually your shelf breaks because you just notice weird things over time. One of the shelf breaking moments for me was I was actually going to the temple with my mom and my wife, and my mom mentioned that she's so glad that they don't do the weird penalties in the temple anymore. And I was like, wait, penalties? They used to do penalties? What kind of penalties? And she said that pre-1990, they actually used to promise that if they ever gave up the secrets of the temple, they would have their throat split ear to ear. They would have their belly cut open and be disemboweled. They would have their heart ripped out of their chest, and they would be sawn in two.
Oh my God!
And you had to act these out in the temple. You had to go like this, and you had to go like this. And where does this come from? It comes from the Freemasons. They used to do this as well. So this is what Joseph Smith took from Freemasonry. He lifted this part of Freemasonry and introduced it into the Mormon endowment. And the Freemasons stopped doing it, I think, around the 80s. But the Mormons continued to do it for a few years after that. And then in 1990, they ran a survey because temple attendance was down. Shocker. And they actually ran a survey asking the members why they're not attending the temple. And all the members came back in this anonymous survey and said, we think the temple is really weird and uncomfortable. And so they were like, okay, it's gone. Remove it. Remove this piece of, the restoration that was, divinely inspired. It's out of here because the survey said so.
Wow.
So that also was just kind of like learning that history of how, first of all, that they were doing stuff that the Freemasons were doing. And then they just remove it willy-nilly just because the survey tells them to. That's also weird because that means like you're now just tapping into the consensus of your membership rather than tapping into what God wants you to do and preserve. So, and then they also removed Satan used to have his minion in the video, and his minion was a Christian priest.
Oh.
And he was a hireling of Satan trying to tempt Adam and Eve with false doctrine. And what's really funny about that is how he introduces himself as he says, "Hey, would you like to learn about the Orthodox faith?" That's what he says to Adam and Eve.
Wow.
And then he starts talking about the Trinity. He strawmans the Trinity, and Adam and Eve reject him, and they reject Satan. So they also took that priest out of their video because it offended a lot of former Christians who had become Mormon. They're like, well, I don't think my old priest from my previous church was, doing Satan's work. I think that's a bit heavy-handed of a critique there. So they also removed that. And so now the temple the Mormon Temple today is much more tame. It doesn't have any of the penalties. It doesn't have the Christian priest in the video, a hireling of Satan being offered money to deceive Adam and Eve. They removed all that. And now women don't promise to obey their husbands. They used to. That also really bugged me when they took that out, because I took that oath in the temple and now it's gone. And now me and my wife are just kind of, making it up as we go, because now we don't know what the proper hierarchy is. So they removed that too because of feminism. And so, it's just becoming a more politically correct version of what was once extremely Freemasonic and weird and creepy.
Yeah. Wow, that's mind blown. Yeah, it sounds. Yeah, they're being kind of arbitrary. They're just kind of changing it with the times. Did they have a priesthood or Eucharist or sacraments? They had a form of baptism, but what about the sacraments? Do they do any of those?
They do. They actually call communion the sacrament. They have it every Sunday. It's literally just Wonder Bread and little paper cups with water in them.
Oh.
They did use wine. During the time of Joseph Smith, but they're very against alcohol, which is funny because Joseph Smith drank alcohol all the time, and so did Brigham Young, their second prophet. In fact, Utah was known for having huge breweries, and that was one of their things that they used for purposes of industry to grow their civilization out west in the Wild West. So it's just weird because it didn't happen until the Prohibition era that they became super anti-alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
But now they use water. They use water and bread. And they consider it more along the Protestant lines of a memorial or a symbolic service, which actually blew me away when I started reading the Apostolic Fathers. When I read St. Ignatius, who's actually the patron saint of our parish that we go to, reading about him talking about how it was the actual body and blood of Christ was so mind-blowing to me, because this is the earliest church father you can read. And I don't know if people know this, but we didn't have the writings of St. Ignatius until the last couple hundred years. And also it was so mind-blowing to me because when Mormons argue for a great apostasy, they point to the real presence and what they call transubstantiation. Mm-hmm. They point to that as one of the defining features of the apostate Catholic Church. So reading that so early on, the real presence, and also reading Justin Martyr also talking about, the liturgy and the Eucharist. I mean, that honestly was just earth-shattering for me, because I was wow, this is this is it. This is real Christianity. And again, continuity versus discontinuity. And I think also just reading about how Martin Luther, when he first came around, he also had a liturgy. John Calvin had a liturgy. So this was a norm for Christians to have a liturgy and believe in the real presence.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until later Protestants that we even had that. I believe it was Calvin who started to even question that. But again, we're talking 1,600 years in to Christianity. So it was just amazing to see that. And they do consider it just kind of a way to renew your baptismal covenant, is what they say, Mormons say. But here's the other thing, I would do it every week, and I never felt it made any sense to me, because they don't do confession. Mormons only do confession if they do something seriously wrong, if they, commit the sin of fornication or adultery, or basically it's usually sexual sin, to be quite frank. That's when they will go and do confession, and they have to do penance where they can't take the sacrament for a while. But my entire time growing up, I never did confession, because I thought I was not ever committing any serious sins. And this is the other difference between Orthodoxy and Mormonism is Mormonism, you kind of can get like the impression, the general impression that you're doing a pretty dang good job and you're pretty like on the ball if you're not breaking any of the major commandments. And then learning about Orthodoxy and just the wrestling and struggling against the flesh and the passions. I mean, that for me just made so much more sense because I was still feeling guilt, but I didn't have a reason to go and confess because Mormonism wasn't really set up for that. I think they kind of wanted people to have what's called toxic positivity, where they're like, everything's going well for me, so I'm just going to like stay put where I'm at. And so you definitely see a lot of complacency where people are just like, yep, I'm good. I just go to church every Sunday. I check the box for the different things. I pay my tithing, you know.
Yeah.
They see it as just checking a box, and they're kind of good in the Lord's eyes, in their mind.
Yeah, so it sounds like it was very like legalistic, not really understanding the spirit of it, you know, just yeah, like you're saying, checking off the box. So would they go to like an elder, or like what was like the priesthood like, or like who would you go to confess sins to?
So this is where it also gets weird because they would go to what's called their bishop, which is just like the equivalent of a priest. He's over a ward, the equivalent of a parish. And the problem is that a bishop is usually just a guy who lives down the street from you, who's like a chiropractor or a dentist or something. So you're going and talking about very sensitive things, sometimes as a teenager, if you've, you know, messed up, as we used to say, to someone who has like no background in being a spiritual father and helping people out of like serious sin. But in their minds, they're like, well, he'll just be led by the Spirit. Like whoever the Lord calls, the Lord will qualify, is kind of their whole philosophy. But the problem is that none of their leadership, even the top brass of the Mormon church, their prophet and their apostles, they're all like former business professionals. Like the prophet right now of the Mormon church, he was a former heart surgeon. So they don't know anything about theology. They don't know anything about the church fathers. They don't know anything about even, like, they probably know the scriptures, like, you know, a decent amount, but it's like when you hear them teach and then you go and you listen to, like, you know, Father Josiah, it's like night and day because, you know, oh, this man actually spent his life devoted to, like, the faith and learning the faith and living the faith. So I think that's also, like, a big issue is they always brag about they don't have a paid clergy. Well, the apostles and prophets are paid, like at the top. They actually lied about that until very recently. They came out that actually they are paid like $150,000 a year, and everything's covered: housing, food, school for their kids. It's all covered. Maybe stock options. That's kind of coming out as we speak. But the bishop is just a volunteer. He can only spend so much time with you because he has his day job, he has his family. So he also just can't devote a ton of time to it. And this is probably another reason why people don't do confession all the time, because I don't even think logistically it could work with the limited time that their clergy has, given that it's all lay volunteers.
Yeah. Wow, that's crazy. So I've heard that is there a ban on alcohol, or is it just like looked down upon? I know, is there a ban on coffee too? I remember like talking to a Mormon.
Yes.
What's the reasoning behind that?
No one could tell you because so coffee, tea, alcohol, tobacco, and drugs, illegal drugs, what they would call illicit drugs. You're allowed to take, like, you know, codeine if the doctor gives it to you. So yeah, like it's just illicit drugs basically. But yeah, the reason why coffee and tea are banned is no one could really tell you. Like some people will say it's the caffeine. Well, yeah, the Mormons drink energy drinks, so obviously that's inconsistent. And then they'll be like, well, it's because it's hot. It's a hot drink, which in Joseph Smith's day, I guess they thought hot drinks were bad for the belly. If you like, you drink something really hot. Well, they drink hot chocolate, so that also like doesn't work. So it's not a consistent thing. It honestly was just made up by Joseph Smith was the first to ban tobacco because at that time there was like a temperance societies that were going around the country, and they were telling everyone tobacco and alcohol are bad for you. But it wasn't like a cut and dry thing. Like Joseph Smith still smoked tobacco and he still drank, and so did early Mormons. Like they didn't think there was anything wrong with it. It wasn't until I think like the 1920s, like around the Prohibition era, that they're like, okay, now we're serious. Now if you do partake of coffee, tea, tobacco or alcohol or drugs, you cannot go to the temple. You cannot be in full fellowship or partake of the full blessings of the gospel, as they would say. So yeah, it's a pretty recent development, but yeah, people are still. I never touched coffee, alcohol, drugs, which is a good thing. Like I think that's one of the
Yeah.
benefits of me
Hmm.
growing up Mormon. I never touched any of that stuff, but I literally had coffee for my very first time, like 6 months ago or a year ago, and I drink it every morning. But yeah, and it's so weird that I drink it and I'm like, oh, this gives me a little pep in my step. But it's so weird that this is seen as like something that can keep me,
Yeah.
out of the celestial kingdom.
Yeah. And then another question I had is, so growing up, you can't go to the temple till you're 18. So what do you do on like
Yeah.
Sundays? Like just the parents would go? Would they have like a daycare on the side of the temple or? Yeah.
No, parents would usually go and on Saturdays because the temple is usually closed on Sundays.
Oh.
Because Sunday you go to church, so they would usually go
Oh.
during the week or on Saturdays, and they usually just get a babysitter. I mean, Mormons are great at babysitting because
Yeah.
there's always like older kids in your congregation. So yeah, we usually have a babysitter on Saturdays, and they would go then.
Okay. And then, is there anything else you want to cover with the Mormonism? I think, we could probably do a part two on that because
Yeah,
there's so much to cover. I had one last question for you, but is there any like last things you want to say
sure.
about Mormonism?
Yeah, I would just say like one thing what got me really excited about talking to you and I plan on kind of putting out content on my own as soon as my spiritual father, feels like I'm, ready to take that on. But yeah, one thing that gets me like really excited and I think other, Orthodox people, especially in the online Orthodox community, should get excited about is like it's a sinking ship right now, the Mormon churches.
Hmm.
I mean, there was just a 60-minute special on the financial scandal that their church is ridden with. And it's also just, there's a lot of good traditionalist minded people like us. Like they would agree with us on a lot of things that's happening in the culture right now. You
Hmm.
can see their takes on Twitter. They're pretty similar to a take that, you would have as an Orthodox person.
Hmm.
So I think there's a lot of commonality there as far as like what they want in a society and what they feel like society should place high priority on when it comes to like family values, for instance. So I think it's a really exciting time because I think there's going to be a massive disconnect between Mormon leadership and Mormon laity when it comes to the church changing and going with the flow of the world. And I seriously think there's just going to be a lot of people quietly leaving at first, which is what me and other people at my parish who are former Mormons did. Like you don't really hear about us. But I think over time, like it's going to be pretty substantial when you see like all these people reacting to major changes in the Mormon church that are right on the horizon. Like they're coming sooner than we think.
Yeah. No, I'm excited I think you would be great if you started a YouTube channel. Like I've seen throughout this interview, you're a really good speaker. You're very knowledgeable on the subjects, and maybe you're going to be the apostle to the Mormons. Like Cyril and Methodius, they to the Slavs. Like you could bring Orthodoxy to more because a lot of them are very conservative. They have good family values, and as that ship sinks, they can come home and have the fullness of the faith. So yeah, that would be awesome to see what you put out.
Part two, we could go into the Great Apostasy. I think that's a really
Yeah.
interesting topic because you get into a lot of history, you get into a lot of the church fathers. So love to do a part two with you on that because that would be like a lot to unpack, especially when you're talking to Mormons and
Yeah.
honestly, just educating them on the church fathers is a big deal.
Yeah, definitely. That sounds like a good idea. But way early on in the stream, you talked about how you were kind of like a libertarian into Orthodox. I think that happens like so many of us. I was
Yeah,
like an anarcho-capitalist, libertarian,
same
but
here.
then
Yeah,
yeah, but then you start
Murray
to
Rothbard. I was reading Murray Rothbard.
yeah, I would watch all these channels online, but then I realized like what really matters is like social cohesion, and you want like a virtuous population, and you kind of turn that into an idol is like this political system, especially like thinking
Mm-hmm.
about like anarcho-capitalism now. It's really more of like a philosophical system because you're in love with like this universal perfect capitalism that it's if we just had real capitalism it would be perfect. But yeah, that was a big shift
Yeah,
for me. But I think a lot of like amazing people started out in that libertarian, but then eventually they come around and realize to Orthodox Church. But
yeah. I remember talking with my parents. I used to argue with them all the time about politics because that was like I was like doing way more deep dives on politics than I was into theology.
yeah.
Until a few years ago. So So I'd always argue with them because they were kind of like your typical like boomer conservative.
Yeah.
Reagan was the greatest president we ever had.
Right.
They still believe there are weapons of mass destruction, for instance. So like
Yeah.
arguing with them, and like at one point I just told them, like, after watching Jay Dyer, who does a really good job
Hmm.
on making the clear distinction there between like pre-enlightenment worldviews versus like post-enlightenment worldviews, and how
Hmm.
the American conservatism comes out of the Enlightenment. It's just like the other side of the coin of
Yeah.
this false dialectic. So I was like trying to explain to them, like, you guys actually are liberals. You're just
Hmm.
like 10
Yeah.
years behind who you consider liberal. And then they're like, well, what do you consider yourself? And at that time, I was like, honestly, like, I look at countries like Russia and I look at countries like Hungary, and I start to like see they're making a lot of sense these days, because I feel like they've struck a balance between like freedom but also order.
Yeah.
Which, yeah, and I think, like, again, I'm not like saying everything is perfect in those
Yeah.
governments or those
Definitely.
societies, but I think, like, if you just look at our Western society and the Enlightenment values with a critical lens, I think it's just really clear. Like you said, you could very easily make an idol of freedom. And what is freedom? It's nothing more than just becoming a slave to the passions. And we see that being acted out at large in our society right now.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think, countries like Hungary are a good example because they put a strong emphasis on like family and tradition, and that's really what we need to get back to is just, it's good to have some level of individualism and people are different, but also you need some level of collectivism where it's like we live in a society together and we should be doing what's best for the entire society. And it's like, arguing with liberals, or even like my past self, it's like, well, why do you care what other people are doing? But it's like we all live together. If like someone else is, mudding the pool, or I don't know, they're making a mess, it's gonna affect you. So it's like, and it's also very like selfish to think like other people in society don't affect you. So I think people just need to think more. They need to think like on a family level, and then if, like a nation is really like a big family, and so we should do what's best for the entire like best for the family and what's best for the country, and like have that order. I think is really important.
Yeah, amen to that. I think, to Tucker Carlson's credit, I think he's done a really good job of introducing this idea of paleo conservatism, like putting American families first, and
Hmm.
all our policies should be derived from that as like our main focus and emphasis. Like, how will our average citizen be able to start a family and
Yeah.
thrive and provide for a family and have stability, for their children and grandchildren and great grandchildren? But yeah, I think, going back to your point, like, it's all just about externalities is a word you'll hear used in economics when they talk about how a corporation, they pollute a river. That's a negative externality. They can
Hmm.
be taken to court and sued and pay out massive amounts of money to whoever was affected by the pollution. I mean, we've seen this play out, but the same thing needs to take place when it comes to culture. Like, think of
Yeah.
all the negative externalities of people living out
Yeah.
their like deepest and darkest fantasies, and those are negative externalities that are going to have just a ripple effect, for the next few generations. I mean, we're
Yeah.
we're seeing it play out today.
Yeah, and it's like it affects all of us, and that's why I care because it does affect us what other people are doing. But I do care about other people. Like it's sad to see people go down these routes, and they're really what they're chasing is like happiness or some sort of fulfillment. But it's like they're following lies from the devil because it's like they think that's gonna make them happy, but it just makes them feel more and more empty. So it's like it's better for us and it's better for them. It's just and that it's better for society as a whole. So
Yeah,
yeah.
I can actually. This could be a good thing to end on, because this kind of gets into like epistemology.
Yeah.
And again, we can kind of touch this more at length in our next call. But I think, like, this idea of being able to follow your feelings is really crucial to Mormon conversion. They're very Protestant, where they just tell someone to read the Book of Mormon, pray about it in
Hmm.
the privacy of your room, and God will speak to you personally and tell you that it's true in your mind and in your heart. You'll have a burning in the bosom. So this is like, they always, when back against the wall, when you're talking to them, they'll always rely on this experience that they had of the divine, that they would label that feeling or thought. And so this is where you actually can make the connection to postmodernism, because if you have the idea that your feelings, and you are like an infallible judge of your feelings, and when God is talking to you, and when it's the right thing being told to you, If you think you're infallible in judging that, you have no right to judge other people who are living out their thoughts and feelings in ways you find offensive and in ways you find destructive. And so this honestly was one of my big breaking points where I'm like, that is not scriptural, first of all, because in the scriptures we learn that, the heart is full of lies, it's full of deceit. Who can know the human heart is what we're taught in the Old Testament. But I think also it just goes to, this idea that you're infallible, which, again, as we know, comes out of the Reformation. They rejected the Pope and they made all individuals their own Pope. Mm-hmm. And I think if you ever are talking to a Mormon about this and their spiritual experience, I think you can ask them that, like, do you believe you're infallible when it comes to knowing the difference between your own thoughts and feelings and the voice of the Lord? And if they say yes, they have now placed themselves above even their own prophets, who they would acknowledge have made mistakes when it comes to listening to the voice of the Lord. And you'd have to just point that out to them. I mean, there's a story of Joseph Smith. He was going to sell the copyright to the Book of Mormon because they were so desperate for money. He told his apostles to go to Canada and sell the copyright to the Book of Mormon, which in itself is a really weird thing to do. But he said, the Lord told me, you need to go do this. They go, and the person tells them, no, I don't want to buy it. It's the failure of the mission. And Joseph Smith's quote at that point is, sometimes we're listening to the Spirit of the Lord, sometimes we're listening to our own feelings, and sometimes we're listening to, like, evil spirits. And he wasn't able to tell the difference at that point in time. Like, he just admitted it. Like, I'm not infallible when it comes to knowing the difference. Like, I was misled, basically. I suffered pre-left.
Yeah.
But so now, like, individual members of the Mormon Church will say, well, I don't have that problem. I know, they'll always say, like, I have a feeling I cannot deny. I have an undeniable witness is the word they'll use. So they're basically saying that they're more infallible than their own prophets when it comes to listening to the Lord and what he wants, his will for them. And I think that's just a very, very dangerous place to be, as Father Seraphim Rose has pointed out. The most dangerous place spiritually you can be is to think you are not open to deception. I think that's just like, that was eye-opening for me, because I was like, wow, talk about a large dose of humility.
Yeah.
Like piecing that together.
No, that's an amazing critique. When the Mormons came on their bikes and I was like bringing up these questions, they didn't have the answers. That's what they reverted to. They said, well, I read the Book of Mormon and I prayed on it, and God revealed to me. And if he handed me the Book of Mormon, he said, if you just read it and pray for it, God. So that's what they are relying on when they don't have any more arguments. But if you bring up exactly what you just said, that's postmodernism, are you infallible? That will totally just debunk it. So yeah, that's a great.
Yeah, they would acknowledge that mistakes have been made in their history. Like, they would say, oh, Brigham Young was wrong to not let black people go in the temple or have the priesthood. Like, they would say, yeah, he was racist. He was wrong about that.
Yeah.
Okay, well, there you go. He's not infallible when it comes to listening to the voice of the Lord on a very important matter that literally affects the salvation of thousands of people. So maybe a little bit of humility would be in order here, given your history and given the history of people who held your same worldview. Not to mention all the other cults who also claim they've had a spiritual witness.
Yeah.
I'm sure a lot of people who followed Jim Jones down to Guyana had a spiritual witness telling them to pack up everything and move down to Guyana with Jim Jones, right? So you also could point that out to them. Like, do you think they were being deceived? Okay, what makes you better than them? And this is where we get back to them being more of a Gnostic worldview, because they believe they're the initiated, and the uninitiated don't have access to the voice of the Lord.
Yeah.
So they are, open to being deceived. Whereas if you're Mormon, you're not. You got that infallible, completely clear channel to heaven.
Mm-hmm.
So this is where, again, it's Gnosticism. Like, they're part of the initiated and other people aren't. So they do have that epistemological certainty that others simply cannot get unless they share their worldview.
Yeah. And I think that's a big problem with like Protestantism, and I would say Mormonism is something that like evolved out of that too. But it's like they depend so much on their own judgment, their own feelings, and it turns a lot of people off, because it seems like they're just making up. They're just making up the spirituality. They're just making up the worship as they go. Versus Orthodoxy, I think, is a lot more rooted. It's rooted in tradition, and it is skeptical of just chasing feelings, because that's, talk about the quote from Father Seraphim Rose. That's how we fall into deception and prelest, is when you're seeking that. Like, we should be skeptical of those feelings. Like, we need to be rooted in the tradition. We need to have a good spiritual father. We can read the church fathers and the great saints And that's what we should be mimicking, not just like being ad hoc about our feelings and worship and everything.
Book, which is like a huge influence on me, was Orthodoxy and Religion of the Future. He shows how that plays out when it comes to ecumenism. Because if everyone feels like they're feeling something and they have different belief systems, but hey, they're all having the same experience or at least similar experiences to each other, I mean, that's all you need for the making of a one world religion right there. Because, oh, you believe in Allah, I believe in Yahweh. I mean, we're still feeling these good feelings when we're together and we're praying together, and the charismatic worship. He points out how theology goes by the wayside. Preserving the faith of the church fathers and the apostles, that just goes by the wayside, and it all becomes about the experiential, what you're feeling in the moment. And that will somehow, unite you to people who have beliefs completely different from yours. And so having the word ecumenism introduced to me also showed me the large scale damage that this personal prelest can lead to. And that's again, eye-opening, just amazing, to have, saints like Father Seraphim Rose, who I consider a saint, because that's honestly what's in the future of our society and what other churches are doing when they are prioritizing personal feelings and experiences over actual truth with a capital T. So that's also something that, man, I was just like, dodged a bullet there.
Yeah, because they're just like chasing a euphoria. Like you go there, the most Protestant evangelical worships, they've got the hands in the air and the rock band. And I was actually watching some videos of like why people left Christianity, and they said like, well, I went to a rock concert and I had the same feeling of God's, and so that's why I left Christianity. Like, so it's like they associate, like what they're feeling is this euphoric feeling from just listening to the rock band. And so when they go to a concert and they like feel the same thing because that's what they think God is, and they just abandon it altogether. Versus like an Orthodox liturgy is like the exact opposite, I think, because it's about inner stillness and participating in the liturgy.
I think it's just like the main thing I noticed when I first started going to the liturgy was it's not about you.
Yeah.
You are in the presence of God and angels and what they're doing in heaven, eternally. It's not about you. It's not about your life. It's not even about time. It's beyond time. I think that is so different from, like you said, Protestant worship. But also, like, I would go to my Mormon sacrament meeting, is what they call it, on Sundays. And there'd be times I never even heard about Jesus once. Like, I literally heard about someone talk about their vacation to back east to visit their kids. Like, because they have, like, testimony meeting, and all these old people get up there and just tell the most long, like, boring stories, like, on the microphone. Like, that's the testimony. We call them, story-monies, because they're just, like, telling stories about themselves, because, that's the way they have a captive audience, I guess. So I would, like, go to these, like, testimony meetings or meetings on Easter, let's say, even. And it was, like, Jesus is barely mentioned because there's just people going up and talking about themselves, because it's all about themselves, because that's how they were converted in the first place, is like their experience. And so when I go to a liturgy, me and my wife were just blown away, because we're like, wow, they're like singing psalms. Like, I'm actually learning the scriptures, like when what I'm hearing the choir singing.
Yeah.
And it's all scripture. Like, there's nothing but scripture. Mm-hmm. And it's all, everyone's facing the altar, including the priest. Like, that makes a lot more sense to me, because in Protestant worship and in Mormon worship, he's facing all of you, and so now the focal point is on him, the person talking. And so I just think, like, when I first went, I was like, this feels so ancient and so, like, authentic and so Christian, like, so Christ-centered. Yeah. It just blew me away, and I was always complaining about that when I was Mormon. I was always like, man, I feel like I didn't even learn anything about Jesus or come closer to him with all these random stories people told.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I think this is a good place to end it. We'll definitely do a part 2 in the future, but thank you.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Appreciate it.